Have you looked at the headlines lately? Honestly, it's incredibly easy to feel overwhelmed. I mean, we're constantly seeing financial markets shaking, massive global inequality, shifting geopolitical power dynamics, and these tragic, seemingly endless conflicts dominating the news cycle every single day. It feels like pure chaos, right? But what if it isn't random at all? What if there's actually a mechanical, predictable logic behind all of this turbulence? Well, today we're neutrally decoding a specific Marxist-Leninist framework from a text called The Age of Imperialism. This is a highly theoretical lens that claims to predict exactly this kind of geopolitical chaos. And whether you agree with it or absolutely disagree with it, understanding how this militant framework constructs its worldview offers a seriously fascinating way to look at the gears turning beneath the surface of global events.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to start with the modern global crisis, move into defining the imperialist age, examine the industry of war, rethink the Cold War, and finally, unpack what the text calls the illusion of democracy.
All right, Section 1, The Modern Global Crisis, A World in Turbulence.
The opening premise of this text hits hard. It argues that our current era of rapid, destabilizing change and deep economic interdependence is absolutely not random. It asserts that to simply sit back and watch these events unfold without a theoretical framework is to be an impotent witness. The author actually uses this 1894 quote from Lenin to establish a very militant purpose right out of the gate. You see, this text isn't written for passive observers. It provides an analytical lens specifically designed for those refusing to accept the status quo. It's aiming squarely at people who feel that the usual, pre-packaged answers of common sense just aren't cutting it anymore, and who are actively searching for an ideological flame to guide them through all these global upheavals.
And the human stakes here are just massive. The text focuses heavily on 1.2 billion young people globally. To put that into perspective, we're talking about roughly 18% of the entire human population. Now, despite their vastly different cultures and living conditions across the globe, the text argues they are ultimately united by what Friedrich Engels famously called the insecurity of existence. So, whether they're navigating the highly uncertain gig economy in European metropolises or migrating across borders in search of basic survival, this framework views them all as a single international class, deeply bound together by systemic exploitation.
Moving into Section 2, Defining the Imperialist Age, Capitalism's Final Form.
According to this text, we actually need to throw out our conventional understanding of this word to grasp the foundational theory here. Imperialism in this lens isn't just bigger countries bullying smaller ones, and it's not just a bad political policy. The framework views imperialism as a mechanical economic inevitability of mature capitalism. It's essentially the inescapable final form that capitalism takes once production and capital have become highly concentrated into monopolies.
What's really fascinating here is how the author takes Lenin's strict 1916 criteria and maps them directly onto our modern world. When you look at these 5 features, the dominance of monopolies, the creation of a finance oligarchy, the massive export of capital, international trusts carving up global markets, and the complete territorial division of the globe, the text argues this perfectly, mechanically describes today's era of massive multinational corporations and global financial crises.
Which brings us to Section 3, The Industry of War, Correcting Imbalances.
So, because capitalism supposedly develops unevenly across the globe, this framework claims it mechanically requires war to forcefully correct economic imbalances whenever tensions peak. The devastating ratio of military to civilian deaths in the First World War is used here to frame conflict not as a moral failure and not as a diplomatic mistake, but as a highly efficient killing industry. It wasn't about national pride at all. According to this framework, it was a totally necessary, violent repartitioning of global markets by rival empires, utilizing every single technological advancement of the era purely for destruction.
And this builds into a really chilling formula presented by the author: double capital, double war. The idea is that as global capital grows, its destructive capacity mathematically multiplies. Because world capital had roughly doubled between the 2 world wars, the framework frames World War II as a mechanical escalation of imperialist conflict. The text points out that this resulted in a staggering 40 million civilian deaths, utilizing devastating new organizational and technological methods, leading right up to the atomic bomb.
Now, you might be thinking about the long peace after World War II, but the author completely rejects that comforting idea. They use an unbroken chain of brutal conflicts over spheres of influence to highlight this point. In fact, the source notes that between 1945 and 2000 alone, there were 188 armed conflicts around the globe. To this specific ideological lens, there is no true peace under imperialism. There are only shifting fronts in an ongoing, permanent global war to secure raw materials and markets.
Let's pivot to Section 4, Rethinking the Cold War, a gangster's deal.
This is where we hit one of the text's most controversial analytical reinterpretations. It argues that a massive ideological split occurred in history that most standard textbooks totally overlook. In this framework, Stalinism is viewed absolutely not as the continuation of Leninism, but as a nationalist counter-revolution. While Leninism demanded that revolution be strictly international to dismantle global capitalism, Stalinism adopted the concept of socialism in one country. The text argues this was simply state-run capitalism defending the nationalist interests of the Russian bourgeoisie, totally betraying internationalism in the process. This radical perspective fundamentally upends how we're usually taught to view the famous 1945 Yalta Agreement between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. The text doesn't see this as some grand ideological standoff between democracy and communism. Instead, it aggressively labels Yalta as a cynical gangster's deal. It argues this was simply rival empires sitting at a table, literally dividing up global markets and spheres of influence while entirely erasing the political autonomy of the international working class.
To back up this gangster's deal claim, consider this absolute powerhouse of a statistic. In 1945, the United States held almost 50% of the entire world's industrial production. The text positions the U.S. as the true, undisputed victor of World War II. It didn't actually have to divide the world with anyone. It simply leveraged its massive economic and industrial advantage to dictate global terms, conceding Eastern Europe to a devastated Russia simply to keep a resurgent Germany in check.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, the illusion of democracy, the best shell.
Here's the climax of the explainer. This is where the framework aggressively critiques the very political systems most of us live in right now. The author defines our current system not as true government by the people, but as imperialist democracy. The text argues this is the absolute best shell for the ruling class. Why? Well, because it provides the comforting illusion of equality and participation, while the real, actual decision-making power has shifted entirely away from parliaments and directly into the closed-door boardrooms of international financial oligarchies.
To really drive this structural powerlessness home, the text uses a striking and honestly pretty memorable metaphor. We are all taught the political principle of one man, one vote. But the text compares this to the economic reality of owning one share in a massive corporation. Just as owning a single share of Microsoft gives you absolutely zero real control over what the corporation actually does day to day, the author argues that a single vote in a modern imperialist democracy is merely an illusion of power, designed specifically to keep you pacified.
The source then brings this whole argument together using a sharp quote from Lenin. It argues that modern democratic systems are deliberately designed as a massive system of flattery and fraud. The endless cycle of elections and the constant, shining promises of reforms are seen merely as tools to distract the masses. It keeps everyone safely within the boundaries of the system so that no one actually attempts to enact real structural revolutionary change.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative question derived directly from this worldview. If this age of imperialism framework is correct in predicting that uneven capitalist development mechanically guarantees endless cycles of crisis and war, how will today's unprecedented, immense concentration of global wealth shape the conflicts of tomorrow? When we look at the geopolitical tensions building right now across the globe, understanding how different ideological lenses interpret these events is absolutely vital. It forces us to ask hard questions about the underlying mechanics of the world we live in. Thanks so much for exploring this complex framework with me, and keep questioning the structures around you.